Thank you for joining us for Decoding AI and Security Operations, Realities, Challenges, and Solutions, brought to you by Devo and Cybermax. I'm Steve Amaro, Vice President of Solutions Engineering at Devo, and I'm joined here by Gary Monty. Gary?
Thanks, Stephen, for this opportunity. I serve as Senior Vice President for Operations and Defensive Security with Cybermax.
Probably the best thing for us to do is just kind of, start with some simple questions and try to understand a little bit more about how Cybermax deals with customers in AI. And one of them that came to mind for me was, can you give me some examples of how you used AI in your security operations center today? And we'll kind of use that to start the conversation.
Sure. We don't want, for especially defensive operations, AI to be the guru on the mountain that you go to and say, okay, here we go. This is, the tiebreaker. And as a result of that, to repeat, it becomes the final authority, or the fallacy of essentially that appeal to authority. We want to be also certain that in every case, if we're going to leverage AI, that it actually benefits our clients and that we're not necessarily deploying it as a novelty alone.
Yeah, I can definitely see how as you become more dependent on it, you can almost become too dependent, right? And eventually arrive at false conclusions. So that makes a lot of sense.
So, with that, it's a great point. And we've kind of treaded into that idea on the use of AI. It's certainly become this grand term, in some ways overloaded. What are your thoughts on that, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like all technology, right? It always starts off with this grand vision of like what it's going to be, right? People think it's going to solve everything, and then it often gets pared back. And I think the economics of it is what often drives it back to that point. Like, it's not feasible to use it for everything.
Right.
And so as time goes on, I kind of feel like it's going to get more and more pared back. We'll see it help. We'll see it be a useful tool in the toolbox, but I don't. Despite some people's views that it'll be a replacement of people in security, I don't see it that way. For one, I just think it's simply too predictable. The very nature of it becomes predictable over time and actually becomes almost an entry vector for a problem versus solving the very problems that we're trying to solve as cybersecurity professionals.
I really like your point about not having this become an either-or decision, right? Either we apply human ingenuity and the like, or we have to go with AI as decision maker. Well said.
So one of the things that my team's been talking about quite a bit is 96% of security professionals that we've surveyed are not fully satisfied with their automation or their use of the automation in their SOC. There's lots of reasons for it: limited scalability, flexibility, cost. What are some ways the Cybermax team has been trying to overcome that and help get more adoption there?
Thinking on that. So I go back to the point you just made about AI as a tool in the toolbox. There's a tendency with, I'll include myself in this group, with all technologists, to want to chase that next really cool thing. And as a result, what tends to happen is there's this tendency for any technology to be implemented for its own sake, rather than enablement of some, say, operational process. So what we tend to do is we seek for those automations that are within the platforms, in the investment that we've made, rather than a wrapper or an extension to the same. So thinking about an example, case management, especially through third parties that allow for correlation, automating of events and the like. There's no shortage of these tools at all. Especially, we'll see them as a front end to SIMs. With the SIM, you want to be able to bring everything to the table, and therefore there are those that are saying, well, let me front end that with some sort of automation. But for us, especially in our partnership, right, with Devo, one of the things that we're saying, well, we've got this alliance, right, and we have access to this toolkit, I'm using your term again, and that leads us to have conversations, as we did just in this last week, around use of SOAR, or particularly in the example I gave of case management, the application of ThreatLink. That's going to allow us to have essentially contextual investigations and the creation of high fidelity detections. In the end, Stephen, we're looking to make the most of what we have before we go out and seek some other alternative automation.
Oh, absolutely. You bring up a good point. there's been a lot of attempts to front end the data with AI, and in some cases filter it down significantly and such. But as we at Devo have been investigating AI, the more we look at it, the more we find that the more signals it gets, the more data you allow to flow into it, actually the better it usually performs. So this concept of throttling it down and reducing it actually is depriving it of kind of the information it needs to make those advanced decisions. So yeah, we've actually found that the people that are more successful with it are actually putting AI kind of on the back end there.
Interesting. So therefore, all right. So now some who are listening to this are going into the area of AI for the very first time, right? What do you think about when you have to advise them, similarly as I'm advising the MDR providers by your earlier question?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind very early on is don't do the same thing everyone did with cloud. There was a point where it was, we're going to put everything in the cloud. It didn't matter if it was logical. It didn't matter if it made financial sense. It didn't matter if it was the right thing to put in the cloud. It just became almost a goal to be 100% in the cloud. And that's not to say the cloud is a bad thing. It's in no way a bad thing. But just like everything, like you need to think about the outcomes that you're attempting to achieve. And in most cases, and most SOC leaders that I'm talking to, they're looking for very basic things. And one of them is just upskilling their team so they can handle more of what they're trying to do in their day to day. And that's where AI can kind of come in and help, right? Or trying to upskill learning within a platform. Devo, like most SIMs, we have a language behind it. We've made it relatively easy to use, but being able to use AI on top of that, for example, to shortcut some of that learning curve, or even taking cases in ThreatLink and summarizing them a little bit more intelligently with AI, are things that we've kind of looked at to try to evolve that past and start to create those outcomes. But it has to start with the outcomes. I mean, that's what matters.
Nice, right? Those outcomes. I think similarly, right? Those discrete business requirements where AI again is fulfilling some need. When we look at that whole continuum, right? Those 7 stages of AI, it feels in a lot of ways we're sort of at that stage 1, maybe a little bit into stage 2, where we're working with, to your point, you gave discrete examples about learning. We're in that narrow AI, right? We're trying to complete specific actions with contextual learning, maybe not the independent learning to its fullest sense, but at least we're able to satisfy a need and know what that is. I think of some of the fun examples out there that we're seeing too, outside of our space, AI powered toothbrushes for optimizing dental care, or essentially AI beehives for care and harvest. But at least they satisfy that point that we're making here about it being for a particular outcome, as you just said. When I thinking through that further, I mean, any other thoughts on your side? I guess I'd pause there. So.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I was kind of curious about is there's a lot of concern about unauthorized AI, right? I mean, like we've talked a lot here about more of kind of the blue side of the equation, right? Of defending with AI and using it to enhance, looking at threats and so forth. But what about the red side of it, where people are you basically using AI within their companies?
Right.
We know tons of companies have risk there. 96% of what we've surveyed have said they've seen that. How do we combat that issue? How do we stop that?
Thinking as we were talking about your point again on outcomes, that's the first that comes to mind. This idea that if I was to take a view beyond that and looking at the ideology of it, I'm suggesting the challenge here is less the use of unauthorized AI software and more about, we're trying to prevent the risk of exposure of confidential data, right? That's what we're saying. And since many of these AI tools by their nature, take these queries and essentially that same confidential data outside the corporate network. So sure, I'd say, okay, if that's the case in AI policy, by all means. But the other thing we might have to ask ourselves under that realm of making best use of what you have is, what is it that's in place presently around corporate acceptable use policies? Do we have clear rules defined for how employees can utilize and are granted access to the network, computing and data systems? This is applicable whether or not AI is involved, and therefore I believe might allow us to be able to have a a firmer approach, I would say, than just trying to identify discrete tools and use cases of AI as a solution.
Yeah, for sure. It's a complicated one, right? Because I mean, in the old days, right, we used to set up things like proxies and just say we're just simply not going to allow you to go to this website. And I'm sure some companies still are very restrictive in that way. But when you look at some of these AI products, I mean, we can't restrict what's put into them, and we don't want to completely cut them off because they are such a huge help to the employees, that are trying to do what they need to do. So it is a very difficult one to solve. I actually could see a world in which we start using things like our UEBA models that we have to try to detect what's going on inside of these models. But I don't think the industry's evolved quite that far yet.
Back to where are we in that continuum, right? If you don't mind, I mean, looking at some of what we deal with on the daily, one of the things that we're considering certainly is the application and how we're evaluating for our MDR services across that continuum of, essentially detect, investigate, respond.
Yep.
If you look along that space, right now, all of a sudden we have to ask ourselves, in that progression, where is AI of greatest benefit? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tend to think that investigate is probably the strongest. I mean, detection, it feels like is pretty well. There's two worlds detection falls into, right? We have standard alerting that comes out of most SIMs, and I think that catches most things. The true unknown is uncaught. And I don't know that at least I've seen anything compelling enough to believe that AI is going to solve the truly unknown. But when you look into the detections or the investigation side of it, and you start looking at trying to correlate things and bring everything to light and kind of have a story of what's occurred, I think there's massive applications for AI there. And so I do think it's a relatively easy area for it to help. Respond is a tricky one though, because I don't know that we want AI to respond. I mean, we look at the SOAR market as an example and the automation that's occurred in that. And we haven't even seen what I would call full adoption of SOAR. I still consider it a very mature security operations center that has large adoption of SOAR today. To get AI to that level seems like we'd almost need to see that first evolve. And I don't know that we've fully seen that level of adoption yet.
Nice. Well said.
So asking you a question there, how do you balance the use of AI and human ingenuity in your operations?
I'll actually take a page from what you were just saying, right? So when we look at that, let's say with that continuum for a minute, perhaps, and say, okay, detect, investigate, and respond is our foundation. Using AI in application of augmented intelligence, I agree, definitely suits us well in that investigation stage. And then, as you just started to allude to, I believe, however, human ingenuity wins when it comes to response, or what I'm going to call the big R for a minute. And what I mean by that is that I'll align again with what you said, Stephen, around in that detect stage, there's this entire path. So you got research, development, deployment, tuning, affirmation. And what's all too common with a lot of MDR providers is the extensive use of platform response, or what I'm going to call the little r, where essentially there's that same sequence that has to occur again of research, development, deployment, and tuning if you're going to have an automated little r response. Now, that's why I'm leaning more toward the big R side on response, with human ingenuity essentially being able to provide scope of compromise evaluation, where we're conducting that level of threat response. And that brings out, you've got these human characteristics of essentially you're going to question your own assumptions. You're going to say, do I have the ability to think recursively about this path that I'm taking and evaluate for the motive? And, that fits squarely in the realm of human ingenuity, that ability to think about motive. Then the scope, I mentioned earlier, that scope of compromise evaluation, where you're taking both a depth look for RCA as well as a breadth look for an environmental view on the scope of the attack. And the last thing that comes to mind, if we want to stick to the cliche of three, would essentially be consequences of whatever determination you make, right? At some point, in that investigation or that response action, you have to say, this is what I believe is the outcome of this chosen path. And what I have to do using human ingenuity is not just apply in the moment, which is where AI tends to be very much focused, is gathering as much data as possible and making a decision within that time frame of the instant, and look at longer term consequences. I have to balance for the urgency of a response, essentially with, quite frankly, other responsibilities to the business, or even thinking further, any ethical responsibility I have. So I'm definitely, in summary, looking more on the response side as synonymous with where human ingenuity wins.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for instance, cutting the CEO's access off. That old, it's a little bit old and it's a little bit worn out, right? But I could see AI just simply doing that and not considering the impact of that when it's critical to that business, right? So it's definitely good to hear, or it's definitely a piece of it.
Nice. So coming full circle a little bit about, so much around this definition of AI and how it's definitely, applied to toothbrushes and the like. I think back 2015, and we had a big surge around the use of IoT, right? And I'm sure you recall, it was IoT for everything, right? Inclusive. Now, what was interesting about that is, as rapid as its rise was, within 3 years, essentially it fell into Gartner's trial of disillusionment, because this realization came to be that, not everything really needs to be connected to the internet. So therefore, again, I prefaced with, I didn't want to sound cynical, but are we repeating that occurrence with AI and its attempt to be all things to all things?
Yeah, I think we always repeat it to some degree, right? Every single technical innovation starts off that way. It always starts off bigger than life. But as we kind of pull that back, we're going to find use cases, I think, that are very specific. One thing that's different in this case versus in the past is when it came to IoT and security, it was kind of a niche thing. This explosion around AI, I feel like, goes well beyond cybersecurity. It feels like it's penetrating all forms of tech, and it's backed by things, by platforms that, brand new silicon advances, for instance, from people like NVIDIA, that have kind of thrust it into the forefront. So unlike a lot of the past around IoT, I actually think this one will stick around. It'll, of course, be painted bigger than it is, and we'll end up finding these niche use cases, like some of the ones we've discussed here, that end up bringing the true value out to cybersecurity. And then there'll be the other side of this coin, and that's going to be the red teaming with AI, the fact that AI is going to become a threat. AI as a way to attack has already started. It's already been seen. It's already out there. And so if we can't match that with some level of AI defense, then we'll simply get outgunned. So I think those elements will keep this from being a complete flop. But it'll of course settle down a little in expectations and become something that we use as an everyday tool. Not necessarily the thing that changes everything, though.
Sure. Nice insight. I love that idea again of being able to say, well, let me go back for a minute and think, when we think about IoT, right, and having to evaluate in that period, it was how to best manage this new form of telemetry that was coming in. Therefore, it felt a little bit outside of what we were doing. AI very much is within the space, and you used two great examples. Certainly, as a defensive posture, that ability to have the essentially augmented intelligence and know that during the investigation stage, as we've spoken, there's a lot of benefit to us. When it comes to, being able to draw in large data sets and pattern mapping, here we are back to the cat and mouse game again. Whereas if it's going to be used on the red side, here we go on the blue side as the best form of being able to find the match and make the identification of AI-enabled threat vectors.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, once it's used on one, it has to be used on the other.
Awesome.
So we'll see more proliferation of it. And I know within Devo, we're very excited about the future it can bring, and we continue to bring innovation around it. I'm sure at CyberMax, you guys are doing the same.
Oh, well said. And for us, again, the position we've taken is where it benefits our clients, we'll find the application, but it's certainly not technology for its own sake.
Fantastic. Well, Gary, I want to thank you for joining me. This has been a fantastic chat.
Likewise, I appreciate the opportunity, Stephen.